Opportunity.
Anti-fragility.
Collaboration.
Inclusion.
Progress.
Action.
Sustainability.
Change.
Accountability.
Impact. Transform. Progress. Collaborate. Opportunity.
Accountability.
Change. Action.
Okay, so this is the closing panel. So first of all, you all deserve medals for staying the distance. I'm Sharan Burrow. I'm a great supporter of the inclusive work of the WEF and the multi-stakeholder approach. I'm delighted to be able to moderate the closing ceremony, if you like, because it is, in fact, a bit of a celebration and a thought-provoking session around what it is. If you've been through 2 days of the Sustainable Development Impact Summit, you saw a lot of the issues and that were raised and talked about, and this was designed to take stock of some of the most promising examples of public-private partnerships, but more than that, about the kind of alliances, the joint commitments, the scaling to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't have to tell you that we are only at 50%, if that, of achievement. And we're a decade out from the 2030 agenda. And the world is more unequal, it's more fearful, there's an age of anger that is growing everywhere simply because of despair. And there's a lack of trust. People have lost trust. And then, of course, we're only at 20%. A fifth when it comes to climate ambition. And we've got just a year to get those NDCs, we call them development plans, but up to scratch before the UK COP. So we've got work to do, and you've talked about this for 2 days. So basically what we need to do today is look at the how, and there are 5 fantastic people, and I'm going to break tradition and ask each of them to give me a sentence about themselves and start already with the one thing, because you can read their bios, and they're all very impressive. But what's the one thing they know, taking out of this, that they need to be able to take back and look to inspire themselves and others to achieve? So I'm going to start with Alessandra on my right, who's an incredible young woman and a campaigner that I'd actually like to recruit. After a 2-minute conversation we were having in the room out there, we wanted to invite you into our conversation because they're already arguing about the challenges, the difficulties, and we're going to try and recreate that. Alessandra.
Hi, everyone. Sorry. I'm Alessandra Orofino. I'm from Brazil. I run an activist network in Brazil, operating in now over 100 cities in some way through different projects. And we train people to become change agents in their community to advocate for policies that work for them, especially locally. One thing that I want to take away with me, well, I think I knew about the urgency already. I think what's been striking for this past couple of days here in New York, in these very special gatherings that we're having this week, is just how many other people are now awakened to that urgency and how much of a generational struggle this is. And I think that the fact that one of the main spokespeople for sustainable development in the world now is a 16-year-old speaks to that generational aspect of it. So I'm definitely taking that back because our generation has no time to lose.
But what's next for you, Alessandra?
In my life?
Yeah, what's the burning passion that you know, with all the achievements you've achieved at such a very young age, what's next? What's that thing that you think, I've got to scale this challenge?
I think that we've been talking a lot about how we prevent terrible change to happen to our planet, but for a lot of marginalized communities in the developing world, some level of suffering is already happening, and it will probably continue to happen even if we can get this right. So what's been burning inside of me is how do we organize people who are the front lines of the impacts that climate change has and other global issues have, so that as they go through these periods of change, of rapid change, they're better able to articulate their needs and to exert power in a way that is coordinated and that guarantees that at least their basic rights are still standing. So I know this sounds a bit pessimistic. I'm not saying that I'm giving up on the struggle to actually preclude the world from, diving into the abyss. But I guess what I'm saying is some level of abyss diving will happen. And what I'm really concerned about is who then suffers the most and how equipped are people to then fight for a more dignified life, even as rapid change happens to them.
So that's an intersection of collective power and resilience
Absolutely.
as a result.
And
Okay.
I think, there's no resilience outside of collective power if you are the little guy, right?
So let's come back to that, because that's a very powerful statement of us thinking about how we frame the way in which we're going to operate. So, Jesper, you of course have a very different set of challenges, but I know that your company's been a leader in these areas. So tell us about yourself, but then also say, what are you taking out now that is the mountain you want to scale out of this, and why?
Very good. I noticed that you're not going to recruit me, so I take that as a bit of a critique. But anyways, let's see what happens. I need to be impressed, I guess. So listen, I think I have an expression to myself. I think I'm going to admit it, since this turning into sort of a public development talk, that I'm consciously naive. And I'm going to continue to be that. I get a lot of courage from the discussions we are having also, because we are not in a good state. We need to have courage, we need to have belief, and we need to be determined. And I think what I take out that I was not, when I came here, that I didn't know, was a determination to try to, as a leader, be the bridge. There's a lot of silos out there between companies, governments, between young and old. And one of the highlights for this week has been to, together with some company leaders and some representatives for the youth movement, to have a couple of hours to talk. And my God, there are a lot of assumptions and confusion around. So I think if I can be part of facilitating dialogue there, it would be great.
Well, there you go again. The power of dialogue is coming out there, and that's from a serious corporate leader who, has a multi-stakeholder clientele, workers, customers, and of course suppliers. So let's come back to some of those challenges, Jesper. Alan, same thing for you. Now, of course, Unilever's a huge company. So tell us what the mountain is that you think you need to scale, and why is it? Why is that your, front of mind thought?
Yeah, so my name's Alan. I'm an adventure motorcyclist who in my spare time sells soap for Unilever. And you know what I've taken away from two things really from the last couple of days. I feel emboldened to prove that business is a force for good. Yeah. That if we run our business responsibly, I profoundly believe we can have an impact, and that we can produce better outcomes for all of our stakeholders, including, by the way, our shareholders. I believe we'll have a better top and bottom line performance by running our business on sustainable principles, and I'm determined to show that. The change in my thinking has been actually began on Sunday night when Jesper very kindly hosted an interaction between 10 climate activists, youth climate activists, and 10 chief executives or old leaders. And it was the beginning of 2 days of just seeing the power of young people. And I'm going to determinedly bring the voice of young people into Unilever at a louder volume than it is today.
Well, there you go. There's a big commitment. I mean, we can hold you to that measurable delivery point. But I thought that, that sense of business is a force for good. I mean, frankly, from a trade union perspective, that's something that is music to my ears, because, we're dependent on the jobs you create. And yet you and I were just speaking earlier in general about the fact that while you have a few 100,000 direct employers, you have 3 million workers in your supply chains that actually help you make the profits. And so in that context, what do we do about that? Because this is not the case in Unilever, let me say, because I've walked some of those areas, although you have difficulties I've actually helped some of your colleagues solve. But our supply chains, by and large, are just dehumanising exploitation. They're built on that. It's often that the CEO of major companies simply don't know, because beyond the first tier, maybe the second, if you're lucky, the third or fourth, there's simply no knowledge of what's out there. So what's the biggest challenge there, Alan?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it is true that being a chief exec is a degenerative disease. And you systematically become disconnected from reality. I accept that point. But look, we have 155,000 employees on the payroll, but I think there's 3 million people come to work every day and only work for Unilever. They would consider that their employer is Unilever. And we have a very enlightened leader of our European Works Council, to speak your language. And Herman, when I met him in the first week in the job, I met him and he had just one question for me. He knows that Unilever will have fewer than 155,000 direct employees in the years to come. It's highly unlikely we'll increase the number of people on the direct payroll. And instead of asking me about minimum wages, factory closures, layoffs, he said, what are you prepared to put on the table as an investment in retraining my people for a future that may well be in Unilever or possibly outside of Unilever? And he really held my feet to the fire on that. He wanted a number. He wanted a number per person. And I think we've made some big commitments there that our responsibility goes beyond our direct employees, and it includes helping people invest for their future in these incredibly fast-changing times.
Well, smart worker leader, but can I say that's the perspective we all have to hold. If we still think that full employment and the dignity of work is really critical to our world, then we have to think about, as jobs become fewer through technology, what is the just transition? Part of it's skills, part of it's income support, part of it's redeployment support. But what is it that we do to build jobs elsewhere that still sustain our communities and, of course, their families? So, Phillip, no, wait a minute, sorry, I missed Melati. You're actually in a different order to my list. But Melati is an incredible young woman as well. And she's got a company name I just love, Bye Plastic Bags. Now, all of you have these big, impressive corporate names or, you know, foundation names, and people say, what do you do? What do you do? We know what she does, but tell us how hard that is, and what's the mountain that's the big barrier for you that you just have to tunnel through or climb over?
Yeah, well, thank you. And Alan, you can actually count my voice in to you know, taking the volume up a notch at Unilever. But bioplastic bags, you know, the whole point at starting this, not a company, an NGO, but starting it at 12 years old and 10 years old with my sister, you know, the point was to make it as clear as possible for people, you know, not to do any small talk, but just to understand what we wanted to see, what our vision was, and what action we required all people to take, all levels of society. And this was a 6-year journey. So tell a 10 and 12-year-old that it was going to take 6 years of their lives, it felt like forever. It still feels like forever. But, you know, I think one of the confirmations that I got from attending these last 2 days is that it needs to be a collaborative effort. You know, not one industry, not one individual can do it alone. But at the same time, while we're moving in this forward-thinking direction, while the ban on Bali is finally in place on plastic bags, straws, and styrofoam, we're now at a very fundamental state in our life where we're saying, okay, what next? And one thing that came up on a panel that I was a part of yesterday, it keeps sticking with me, and it's actually the lack of definition. So we're not seeing clear guidelines of, for example, what does sustainability mean? What does alternatives mean? And I think we all have our own definitions, we all have a general understanding, but there's too much of a gray area for us to be on the same page and move in the right direction. So for example, one of the biggest challenges and something I take back home as a challenge is to set more in stone of how we can come up with a definition where when we go into a meeting, sustainability isn't being questioned, alternatives isn't being questioned, and we all understand what these terms and definitions really mean.
Okay, and last but not least in this introductory round, of course, is Phillip. And Phillip is a social innovator by title in my bio, but He described himself as a teacher, and earlier when he was helping me actually figure out how to pronounce your original company name, and in fact, that's of course sings to me way back when I was a teacher myself. But Phillip, what is a social innovator, and what does that mean in terms of the key challenge you're trying to drive change in right now?
On this panel, I think it means that I am neither young nor rich. Fairly convinced
Yeah.
that that's
Well, you
the
could say
definition.
we're bookends in that regard, Phillip.
I see you, sister. So it's true, I'm a professional nerd, I'm a professor in my day job, and my side hustle is that I run a nonprofit 501c3 called the Center for Policing Equity. We work inside of law enforcement, collectively, collaboratively with law enforcement, to use big data techniques to make them less racist and less deadly. And as I was saying over the weekend, it's a little bit of a sad thing that we're also in a growth industry. I want to make it really clear this is not just a US issue, though. Right, so for those of you who were asleep in the midst of your introductory to psychology courses, you may recall Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that after we have our biological needs met, that safety is the next most important thing. And that need for safety is universally human, but it is not equally distributed. So that's part of what we work on, but in terms of the great mountain and what I'm called to do after 2 days that have been incredibly engaging, I have to say, Alan, I'm excited to hear that you were ready to trumpet business being a force for good. One of the things that was surprising to me was both how little direct connection I felt from the folks I spoke to here and how much eagerness there was to have connection to the people who are most proximate to the problems in the SDGs. Right? If extreme poverty and inequality, if those are issues that are being driven in part by climate change and in part by the other factors that we all know are out there, it's important not just to have a C-suite explanation for how those things get fixed. Because Brian Stevenson and many before him have said, those who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. So what we need to do is make the people closest to the problem closest to power. And in this room, that becomes possible in a way that in the communities that I work in, with the blue-collar folks who are also not college-educated, trying to do the best they can in law enforcement in the United States, Canada, South Korea, South Africa, right, Latin America, all over the place, in Brazil, the first international place we worked, they don't understand that what's happening here can be a force for good in their lives. It's a necessary evil. But the idea that there are partnerships available when there are ears that can open up from the ground to the great heights that we're at right now, I think that would be even more inspiring for them than it would be for the people in this room.
So in terms of rebuilding trust and hope, then you're talking about how you give people the power of their own voice individually, collectively, and how and why that and how we get that to matter again to policymakers, government officials, people, and you've heard a bit of that reflected here. But I can tell you the statistics show that only around 37% of people think their voice matters to anybody, mostly to their governments, but to their employers, to, their kind of social structures and so on. That's a terrible, terrible breakdown in trust of your worth as an individual, let alone our governance structure. So I think what you're touching on is a very powerful piece. But in that context, and you've all talked about the SDGs and you've all talked about climate, but you've also touched on the technological challenges. And so I'm sitting here with a question about, can technology foster the more inclusion, first of all? Can it foster more inclusion? But also, what are the dangers of greater divides? Because I think we have to tell the truth about both ends of the spectrum. And I'm struck by something the Secretary-General, actually, Guterres said on Sunday night to a dinner with the Global Compact Board, where he actually said that climate, the challenge of our time, of course, but also that the other thing that keeps him up at night is wondering whether we have gone beyond already the capacity to have the governance structures to mitigate and manage technology that very soon could be beyond the control of human beings. So technology, the power for inclusion and the threat for division. Who wants to tackle that first? Alan, you talked about the power of young people. So what do you say to them when they ask you those sorts of questions?
You know, I was out thinking there. My mind was on a whole different train of thought about the breakdown of trust and how sad it is. So I'm sorry I wasn't really listening to the question. But I do know that the...
But you're going to answer it.
I'm going to answer it anyway. Never miss a chance to have a microphone in front of your mouth. Anyway. You know, there's an institute in Cambridge University that's studying what could cause the catastrophic demise of humankind. And they have 4 potential drivers, climate change, of course, being one of them. But AI and technology is one. I was really shocked when I read that in their view, we may have passed the point where the machines will decide that the most destructive force on the planet is mankind and start taking actions to reduce the power of mankind. It's a very dystopian thought, but interesting. In our business, for sure, technology is a force for good. You know, it allows us to dramatically increase the number of people who participate in our business, from simple things like we can be much more inclusive, not just of gender difference, but of ability difference. We're really doing a big push at the moment on bringing disabled people to work in Unilever, not out of pity or responsibility, but because they're better at certain things. So we've discovered that blind people have got an unusually good listening skills and empathy capability. And so across our business, but it started in Egypt, our call centers, our customer service lines are being staffed by blind people because they're better at it, but they're only able to do it because of technology. We're discovering that people on the autism spectrum are better coders, and so a lot of our engineers, we're deliberately recruiting for them being on the spectrum. Again, only possible because of technology. So I'm going to ignore these warnings about, you know, AI wiping out mankind and continue to think of technology as a great enabler of inclusion in business in the world.
I'm going to not ignore the warnings over here. As a professor of data science who also works in AI, I'm terrified. And the reason I'm terrified is not because computers have become sentient and Skynet or any of the popular movies that we all have seen at various points in time. It's because, at this point at least, artificial intelligence and machine learning are tools of the values of the people programming it. That's terrifying to me. Not because the people who are programming it have particularly bad values, but in part because we haven't defined what the value should be. So there are often no values. There is no such thing as technology that helps without an intent, without a theory of a problem and a theory of change. But if we haven't articulated what the set of problems are, or if we've, even worse, misdefined what those set of problems are, we don't have tools, we have toys with no values. Very powerful toys with no values. I can tell you, in the United States and in the UK, where we're using AI to look at who should be punished and how, what we're doing is we're codifying the set of biases that we haven't figured out how to root. So I am very, very concerned that what we're doing is not just accelerating the capacity for human connection, but for the capacity for human cruelty, because we have not stopped long enough to define what values we should share and how that should shape what we build.
We talk about how do you maintain human deployment of technology, and that does mean governance. And in fact, I was at the WEF Centre in San Francisco, and the Mayor of Oakland, this is simple AI technology really in the spectrum you were talking about, but the Mayor of Oakland simply said she'd banned facial recognition in her city. Why? Because the bias was such that it went down the chain, white men, white women, you know, African American males, and then African American females, and then a various intersection of other cultures. And she said, I can't have that in my city. Now, that's courageous, and not until it's proven that the bias is eradicated. But that was just incredibly courageous, because that's standing up to tech companies who are investing in this without defining the value set and testing the AI against what that is. But listen, we've got two young people here who are, in fact, the kind of...
So fast, Jesper.
Well,
She didn't mean you.
I'm scared of them when it comes to technology, because I'm always asking someone younger than me, how the hell do I make this work? And so, Alessandra, what excites you about, technology and inclusion, and what worries you? What's the fear you have?
I have a similar fear to what Phil expressed. Of course, technology is built around the values of the people who code it. My biggest fear, though, is that we can't figure out a governance for technology, because really we haven't figured out a good governance for our societies at large. Democracy is failing a lot of people, and it's being challenged every day, and we just haven't figured out how to make it better, make it work for everyone, save it in many ways. So of course, if we can't rule our world, what chance do we have of actually setting up a governance system for technology that works when there's so many other complexities related to the fact that these are new problems? Like, we haven't really solved old problems yet. So that really worries me. On the other hand, as I was saying before, I really do believe that in a world where the most outrageous type of inequity is actually inequity of power, collective action is really at the core of any solution that leads to less inequality. And collective action can be supported by technology in many ways, because one of the many good things that technology does for us is that it lowers the barriers to entry to many types of activities. And that includes things like standing in solidarity with someone else, or helping a neighbor, or even finding out what your community needs and having an aggregated view of how you can help and what the problems are. All of these things are easier with technology. As we sort of grown more and more apart and we're more isolated, all of the structures that we created to sort of mediate collective life are being essentially serving the few, not because they were necessarily designed that way, sometimes they were, but mostly because it's really hard to have the time and the knowledge to participate in collective life if you're stuck commuting for 4 hours a day, working 2 or 3 shifts, trying to get by. What technology oftentimes does is make it easier for you to participate in collective life, even on that spare time, even when you have so much going on. And of course, that's one application of technology, but it's a possible one. So I'm excited for how we solve these two problems at once. How do we think about democracy? How do we think about governance for our societies at large? And how do we think about how technology can serve that? And I have a feeling that at the intersection of these two challenges, there will be an answer for the fears that we have around racist, misogynistic biases in technology. Because once people that are at the margins start benefiting from technology and being interested in it and building it themselves, then of course their values are reflected in that system as well. So that's sort of what's been exciting me in this sort of next phase that we're about to enter to.
Go for
Can
it.
I jump in? No, I think I was just reflecting about, maybe since Siri has never responded to my Swedish English, I was thinking if that's some sort of exclusion going on. But then again, I think we share the fear. But at the heart of this discussion is human, and you can't have your values on the surface, right? You have to have that within what you do. And I think what basically this Times course is for an ethical discussion with commitments around how we use data. And I know that several of us are working on that. And maybe like we do in so many other areas and fields, we need to come together. To Melati's point, we can't have too many standards, but if we can come around one ethical standard and also challenge some of the young technical leaders who have maybe a little bit too little of classical education to have been into those topics, to say that there are some things that are not okay. And that has to not be only on the surface, but actually behind everything you do. And then you're going to be a winner, because I share what Alan is after that. In the end of the day, we're going to prove that ethical business and sustainable business is the only way to do business in the future.
Okay.
Can I add something? Just having graduated high school, I speak on behalf of all of my high school friends and just the education system. I think if we're actually looking at how we want to move forward in the future, talking about topics like technology, we need to start at a way earlier age. We can't expect, just these topics to start happening only in universities or only at high-level conferences. I had to go out of my high school experience to attend these conferences to be able to learn about these things in the first place. And I think that in order to have a better understanding and to set in deeply those values and those core beliefs of how we want to move forward, of what is important for us as humans to hold on to really value that human connection and not lose it to technology. That is a conversation, that is a lesson that needs to start happening at a way earlier age. And so that's where, I really believe as well, to mobilize action for more inclusive societies has to start with changing the way we see education today. It is not currently set up for us to involve young people at a serious level. It's not involving young people with relevant issues. We're not learning things in the classroom anymore, in these four walls of what is actually happening in the world that we are living in. So to engage as students with topics like, technology, understanding all the different solutions that are at our fingertips, that can't come at us after we graduate high school, because then we've just gone through an entire process, and here we are at graduation, throwing our hats up off the air, and realizing that we don't understand anything. It's a whole new world that we're looking at. And I think that's why, for me, something that I'm really passionate about, if you couldn't tell already, is the education system. Because at the rate that it's going at right now, it's not just Fridays that we'll be needing to strike. It'll be every single day, because all of a sudden, out in the streets, out at these sorts of conferences, are we finding the information that we really are craving for? And that's I think also another important tool of technology. Okay, my phone is how I communicate what I'm experiencing at these conferences back out into the public and back out into all my followers and friends who are, aren't able to tap into these topics. So for me, my perspective on this issue is sort of including it and changing the way we see education.
So let's think about that, because we've heard here that, resilience, you can't build resilience if you don't have collective power. We've talked about the threats and the opportunities for inclusion of technology, and we've talked about the education, but let's broaden it to skills that are going to be necessary, today and through the future, plus the fears that, people have raised. But we know if we're going to make the challenge of sustainability, deal with inequality, that while we have to tackle that everywhere, we're going to have mega cities. We're going to have mega cities. And right now, if you look at it, we've got all of these issues in our cities. So how do we reach the climate targets? 50% of emissions plus reside in the cities. Look at the industries that are possible to help us and the technology resolve it: mass transit, electric vehicles, the capacity for automation and e-governance, and you think of all the things that people can actually, bring together in a city where all the supply chains around manufacturing and construction materials and so on. Let us have a zero carbon, water positive infrastructure, plus the educative base of the people living there, but also the question around inequality. I mean, if we don't deal with that in this new vision of what's a livable city, we're going to end up with something, I think what Sheila says is 1 in 4 or 5 people live in slums now, and it could be 1 in 7 in this context. So let's just imagine we're all kind of building a plan for the city that we want to build. And, Alan, you talked about the massive number of employees, the voice of youth. Where would you start? You're the new chief town planner. You've got a disaster that we've created on our hands anywhere you look. You've got a few bright spots on the horizon. Where would you start?
Well, first of all, thanks, Phil, for a challenge. We said we would try and spice up the panel a bit, get a bit fruity, a bit sporty, instead of all agreeing with each other. Let me sort of try and lob one out there that might be slightly controversial. I had the great privilege of living for 5 years, in the not too distant past, in Shanghai, in China,
There's a city.
My kids have, the great privilege of living in a few different places around the world, but 2 of the 3 of our kids would describe Shanghai as their favorite place that they lived, and they've lived in nice places. And I think on this, like on many things, the Chinese have got it pretty much right. So they have a point of view on town planning, which is they don't want Shenzhen and Chengdu and Beijing and Shanghai to get any bigger. And they're putting in place very deliberate policies to create sort of 1 to 5 million population cities, because they believe that infrastructure does not break down at that level, but does start to break down when you get these mega cities. And so, here's the controversial bit. Maybe democracy is a little bit overrated. Doesn't seem to be working very well in lots of places. And some... If I was the town planner, I'd take a very autocratic approach to it, and I'd mandate a certain size of conurbation where infrastructure can support it, and it can be easily assembled on much more sustainable principles rather than these crazy, broken capital cities in Asia. I don't know if you spent time in Jakarta, Manila, Bangkok, or increasingly New York City. You just can't get around. It's dramatically inefficient. It's a massive carbon polluter, unlike clean China. Oops. So that's where I'd start with quite an autocratic approach to town and city planning, modeled on the Chinese.
Come on, Alessandra. I know you want to get into this.
I'm
thinking Rio, Sao Paulo. Come on.
No,
and don't hold back.
I won't, no. No, but I agree that democracy is broken. I don't think it's overrated, though, not as a principle. I'm going to tell you an anecdote, but I think it's useful. I've been campaigning at a city level for a decade now, and that means that I've seen transitions in leadership in all the cities where I work in Brazil. And in Brazil's biggest city, in São Paulo, one of the very first campaigns that my group ran there was around opening up streets for pedestrians on weekends. São Paulo is a very car-centric city and wanted to make sure that people had green spaces, or at least spaces without cars, next to their houses during the weekend to take their kids, etc. We ran a big campaign on that. It was a big victory. We won. All great news. And then there was a leadership transition. A new mayor was elected. And most of the time, that new mayor campaigned, his main campaign theme was he was going to change everything and essentially undo all the policies that the previous mayor had implemented on every level, because the previous mayor was a corrupt, in his view, crazy person, and he needed to sort of undo everything. He won the election, and indeed, he undid many of the policies that his predecessor had implemented. The only policy that survived, and let me preface this by saying his other campaign priority was getting the city back, accelerating the city, and he was very pro-car, and he campaigned on a platform that was very much associated with the car industry. The only policy, miraculously, that survived the transition was the opening of streets to pedestrians, which was completely against the values that he had professed during the campaign, his sort of pro-car stance. But the reason it survived, and I'm not saying this, he said it, was because that particular policy was something that the people of São Paulo had pushed for. He had popular buy-in. So I'm telling you this anecdote to say that unless we're really willing to discard democracy completely, which I wouldn't do for many, many reasons that I don't need to get into here, I wouldn't go the autocratic route. Not even if it works in the short term. Because my experience is that with any sort of leadership transition, even if it happens outside of an election or through other means than democratic means, if there is no popular support for a solution, it is a fragile solution. It is not resilient. Of course, the Chinese have a very special situation going on when it comes to autocratic regimes, and it's lasted for a long time, but in most places, even autocratic regimes don't survive. I come from a country that has had 5 constitutions just in the 20th century, and we had plenty of dictatorships. They all ended eventually. So I'm not just talking about democratic leadership transition, I'm talking about any kind of leadership transition. When it happens, the things that survive are the things that are seen as being the people's will. Not because people are respectful of the population, but because they know that there's more political capital associated to policies that have people's buy-in. So I wouldn't go the autocratic route, mostly because I don't think it's a resilient way of going about change at a city level.
But I think Alessandra's point about being close to the people, which she made right up front, is really important because, you know, one of my favourite mayors, and I actually think they are often the success stories of democracy because they are close to the people, is Raymond Johansen from Oslo. He just fought a brutal election and won, but people had to make a choice because Raymond's really provocative. He's determined to have a circular economy for a city. And he was going to stand on that relentless of what the, you know, irrespective of what the challenges were, which are about, you know, toll roads and people being against toll roads and all sorts of things. So I actually think the city concept, you know, you can look at both mechanisms for developing cities, but I do think that if we're going to rebuild democracies and we're going to meet the challenge, we have real chances in cities. But I don't know what the corporate world thinks of that. What do, you know, I mean, I know that, Alan, you were being very provocative and I appreciate it because that's what I told you to do. But, you know, Jesper, where do you sit?
I'm Swedish. I agree with everybody. And no, I think you know what? I want to add to the flavor also. I think it's slightly tilting to this topical conversation. We're closing an amazing week. And we have to, however we define it, I think, Sharan, I'm curious actually on your point of view because you say it's kind of dark with a few bright spots. And I tend to think about it like the opposite. I see so many good examples. And I would like to shift the conversation to the great things that happens and the examples. We would love to be part of, from my company, to show those as much as we're happy to open up and say, please challenge us and criticize us or whatever. But have a look at the things that we as human, as mankind, what we actually are capable to achieve together. So I think that is an important thing. Now, my experience is that I have traveling a lot, meeting colleagues on the store floor and in many other places. We do have in my company a policy that all of us work a couple of days per year with our colleagues doing the dishes in the store, unpacking, etc. Now, when I interview my colleagues, what they think is important, there is nothing in our boardrooms that people don't know. There is no questions, no strategic thought that is not basically present all over when I meet my colleagues in Seoul or in Amsterdam or in New York. And that gives me a lot of hope. Then a lot of people don't see the value of that or don't realize the power of that. So how to connect and how to be part of and unleash the community to be part of the solution, I think, is one of the ways we can go quicker to that slightly brighter future.
But that's a very democratic structure in itself, isn't it? And that's commendable because then people feel, you know, that they do have voice and they do have power in that. Melati, what do you think about all of this? I mean, you've actually driven a huge shift already in Bali, which is, you know, the number of straws that people would drink in their cocktails in Bali, I guess, is, you know, uncountable, really. And yet you've shifted them, not without pressure, but you've shifted them, and that's changed a city on one level, but probably on a whole range of levels because of the campaigning to initiate change.
Okay, so I'm going to ask everybody in the room to just sit a little straighter and join me in taking a deep breath in on the count of 3, okay? All right. 1, 2, 3. Take a deep breath in and out. Okay, and I do this exercise almost on every stage I go to, and usually high school groups are my favorite because when I ask them to take a deep breath in, it's like the noise is up here, okay? So I want you to match that. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Take a deep breath in and out. So I do this for 2 reasons. The first one is because when I get a question like this, it's always good to have a breather. And the second reason is the real reason, and it's actually because it's a strong reminder that 70% of the oxygen we breathe is produced by the ocean. Okay, I'm not a city girl. I'm an island baby. I was, you know, my palm trees are the skyscrapers here in New York, and wow. You know, so I come from a community where I live in the middle of the rice fields 100 meters from the ocean. Indonesia is one of the largest archipelagos. We have 17,000 islands, and yet each island has our own strong community. And the one thing how I think our systems really worked is we follow this way of living. It's how I was raised, and it's how I see how governments can better work together, how businesses can better work together, how people in general can live in harmony with each other again. And it's this concept called Trihita Karana. Living in harmony with the people around us, the environment around us, and the spirit within. And this is where the truest form of balance comes in. So all of a sudden, take out capitalism, take out consumerism, and we understand a more balanced way of living. And sometimes the craziest part about all of this is that it's not a new way of thinking. It's just understanding how to connect back to our roots. And sometimes that unlearning process is the most difficult part, because we've gotten comfortable and we have to break the status quo. We have to become uncomfortable. And so I think that's a little bit of how my island baby perspective can enter this conversation.
I think that's a lovely sense of spirituality about reconnecting our humanity. But why don't you try to teach them the phrase? What is the saying again?
Hita Karana.
Okay, one more time, and then we're going to ask them to repeat it.
Trihita Karana.
Trihita Karana.
Trihita Karana.
Trihita Karana. Come on, everybody.
Trihita Karana.
People can do this. Come on. Lead them again.
Trihita Karana.
Trihita Karana. Come on, one more time.
Trihita Karana.
Okay, that's pretty good. Now we've got a few minutes left. And Phillip, did you want to buy into the city democracy, where would you start question? And then I'm going to ask if someone out there has the most provocative question of anyone or all of the panel.
So, I mean, it's right at this point talking about democracy is the worst form of governments except for all the others, right? But I do want to go back to one of the things that you said earlier, which is that only 37% of the world's population feels like they have a voice. So is it democracy if it doesn't really belong to the people at the bottom and on the margins? So I'm actually, perhaps surprisingly, I'm agnostic about whether or not an autocratic solution for how we build a particular city or a democratic solution is the way that we go. I am really, really passionate about the idea that those at the margins need to be invested in what it is that we're building. Because what I see every day in the communities that feel like they've been left behind, maybe the better way to do this is to tell a short story. Because of my personal interests as a researcher and within the Center for Policing Equity, I get a chance to work with kids who have contact with law enforcement all over the world. And so I was in a city south of the equator, about to give a brief lecture to kids, because nothing that kids like more than lectures from professors. And I happened to be sitting on a bench outside the room. And kid who was younger than the demographics of the people I was going to be speaking to came up along and said to me, "Oh, are you caged too?" So what kind of existential question is that? Am I in my soul? What do you mean? But it turns out that the school, about 10 seconds after the classroom is supposed to start every period, there's an electronic lock. Locks the doors. Can't get in or out for another 15 minutes. Even the teacher's on the inside, unless there's an emergency, you have to pull the fire alarm. And if you happen to be kept outside, right, you didn't make it to your classroom, the other kids call that being caged. And later on, when I had a chance to talk to the students I was supposed to talk to, they referred to themselves not just as throwaway kids, but as throwaway people. There is no city, there's no village, there's no town, there's no nation, there's no global community that can be built with people who feel like they've been thrown away. So regardless of the size of the city, and I tend to agree, smaller can be better, at least there should be a cap on that. Regardless of how sustainable the environmental elements of it are, if people don't feel like they own their own labor or the spaces where they live, if they don't own their own communities, what we're doing is we're reproducing the injuries that we're doing to ourselves. So that's probably how I would leave it.
Okay, so I've just realised I'm being a very bad moderator, and I've only got a few minutes left before, we have to wrap up. But I'm going to turn this on its head. Normally we ask for concluding remarks from the panellists. I want just 3 people who are going to be brave enough to tell me What's the one thing they're going to take away as their challenge? What's the mountain you're going to scale from this discussion, or indeed the last 2 days? And you've got literally 20 seconds to tell me what that is. Who's brave enough to stand up and make that commitment? Nobody. Yes, great. You're a hero.
Working on food system transformation, and it has energized me on the working on the integrated value chains in such a manner that we have a sustainable food security system.
I love that. 40% food wastage, some of the lowest paid workers in the world producing our food and without which we can live. Sustainable food systems. Give him a big hand. Is there anybody else out there with something they just are burning to say they're going to do it? What do there must be something you are going to do. Come on, don't be shy. You're all WEF people, for goodness sake. Yes, good.
I work for Alan, and so whenever he's wavering on decision, I'm going to remind him of this panel and make sure he takes their action.
That's fantastic.
Oh boy. I should actually repair your reputation, Alan. I asked him to be really provocative. In fact, Unilever, can I tell you, amongst other companies, but Unilever allowed their workers to go join the student rallies on Friday. They heard our call for support for the student strike, so he's a good guy, really. Okay, one woman. I need a woman. Come on, you can't let these blokes hog the floor. A woman with a big challenge out there. Alessandra and Melati need you. Yes.
I think I'm going to go and campaign to get Trump out of power.
Oh. Now that's a way to end the session, but is there one sentence that any of you want to say to wrap up? I notice you've been writing, Alessandra, so what's the sentence?
Well, good luck to you. Really.
For all of us.
Yeah, well, no, my sentence is, no, it's more of a plea, because I've been hearing, like, this is a theme. I know that we're trying to solve really complicated issues, and the stuff of democracy, the stuff of citizen engagement, the stuff of working together is complex, and it takes time, and I think it's tempting to say that we don't have time for it, because in many ways we don't. But I'm really urging you not to leave it behind, the idea that we need to make decisions together and implement them together, because I really do think that the main question in this new era that we're entering, an era in which the climate crisis will be a part of our lives, even if we are able to make it less chaotic, a key question will be equity and how people are included or excluded from the process. So I urge you not to leave equity as a value behind.
Don't leave equity as a value behind. One sentence.
One long sentence?
No,
Oh,
short
okay,
sentence.
okay,
You're
very good.
Swedish. Come
No,
on.
I'm on the same track as Alan. We're going to prove that sustainable, ethical business is the best way of doing business.
Great. Business model, sustainability at its core. Alan, you get to repair your reputation in one sentence.
Whatever we're doing, let's have some fun doing it.
Yeah, hear, hear. Hear, hear. Melati.
The education system is broken and it needs to change.
Okay, that's a challenge to teachers. Phillip, go for it.
In these spaces, it's very common to feel like we have the power to speak for the voiceless. I would encourage you to fight that temptation and instead pass the mic.
Fantastic. Aren't they great? Give them a big hand. And now I get to tell you, just get a couple of minutes, if you can stay, and the panellists will stay, to listen to two, very significant people, leaders in their own right. Ignazio Cassis, of course, is the Federal Councillor of Foreign Affairs for Switzerland. Ignazio, are you here? Please come and take the podium. And then Brende, you're going to come up and wrap up. Everybody knows Brende Børge, but he's going to wrap up for the session. But thank you very much for allowing us to entertain you, hopefully educate you, and we had some fun along the way.
So good evening, everybody. Dear President of the WEF, dear Mr. Brende, Madam General Secretary, Madam Burrow, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The discussion that have taken place over the last 2 days here at the Sustainable Development Impact Summit have shown the great importance of finding innovative common solutions to implement the 2030 agenda. Once again, the World Economic Forum has demonstrated its unique convening power to foster public-private cooperation and bring on board actors from all sectors towards a common objective. Private sector engagement is crucial to the advancement of the 2030 agenda. The business community is the main driver of inclusive economic growth and decent job creation. It generates the new technologies that we will need in order to address global challenges. Switzerland, which is not Sweden, is proud to have contributed to this dialogue and confirm its willingness to work even closer with the World Economic Forum on financing the Sustainable Development Agenda. In our view, it is important to boost private sector involvement and to use sustainable finance as an accelerator. Switzerland is one of the world's leading financial centers and a global hub in the field of innovation and sustainability. We have ranked again #1 in the World Innovation Index this year. We want to build on this position by setting trends and leading the way forward. Sustainable finance is becoming mainstream in Switzerland, even in the Swiss banks. To be effective, measures must be ecological, economically, and socially sustainable. Under the Paris Agreement on climate change, Switzerland has committed to halving its greenhouse gas emission by 2030 compared with 1990 levels. In this context, in the context of the climate summit, Switzerland announced the ambition target to reduce its net carbon emission to 0 by 2050. This target is in line with the findings of the IPCC 1.5-degree report. Furthermore, the fight against climate change has been defined as a strategic focus of Switzerland's international cooperation for the period 21 to 24, which is in my ministry. We will strengthen the provision of expertise, technical solutions, and financial resources for climate protection as part of our international development projects and via international funding mechanism. The private sector also have a vital role to play in curbing the effects of climate change by limiting carbon emissions and deploying effective measures for climate change adaptation. Climate change will impact business and industry worldwide. In fact, the 2019 WEF Global Risk Reports lists extreme weather events, failure to implement sufficient climate change mitigation, adaptation, and natural disasters among the top 5 threats. This shows that decision makers from both the public and private sectors are becoming increasingly aware of the consequences of climate inaction. And so in Switzerland, we are aware that climate change affects human security. By investing in climate change mitigation and adaptation, we are ultimately investing in our own security. New business models and technologies are needed, especially on climate adaptation. We as governments in Switzerland as well as in countries are keen to engage in and collaborate with private sector entities from small startups to multinational companies to foster a global paradigm shift towards sustainable development and a low-carbon economy. Switzerland is and remains one of the world's most innovative countries. Innovative approaches are key when it comes to anticipating and finding viable solutions to future challenges. Steve Jobs would say, it's not faith in technologies, it's faith in people. Achieving international and national goals through innovation with public funding alone will not be sufficient, as we all know. Mobilizing action for inclusive societies seeks to include all members of society. Leaving no one behind means addressing the specific needs of people in vulnerable situations, but also empowering them and engaging them in decisions that impact their lives. Individual responsibility and freedom are our driving forces. Achieving the SDGs will contribute to peace and stability in the world and to my country's security and prosperity. As it stresses in the Swiss Constitution, the strength of a people is measured by the well-being of its weakest members. Finally, I would like to commend the continuous efforts of WEF in engaging political, business, and other leaders to shape a sustainable world based on inclusive societies. Gathering world leaders and experts and exchanging views and ideas on sustainable development significantly helps to identify solutions and support their effective implementation. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you these 2 words.
Excellencies, dear friends, dear colleagues, firstly, thank you to the Federal Councillor for your kind words. Also, thank you to a great closing panel. It was fun, but it was also an underlying seriousness that was very important. I think in many ways we are at crossroads when it comes to a lot of the questions being also discussed during these 2 days at the summit. It is really at an inflection point when it comes to now also walking the talk. And I will come back to the concrete outcomes of this summit that is quite a long and impressive list. But this is also the opportunity for me to thank you as participants, also for being part of the 2019 Sustainable Development Impact Summit. And it is really about impact. All the groups that have been meeting have discussed concrete initiatives and how to make it happen. And I think also we have seen that there is now a real commitment from the business sector, not only from these 2 great CEOs that we have on this panel, but we have seen that there have been CEOs and chairs from companies representing more than $1 trillion in annual turnover here at this summit, committing to these courses. And it has impressed me that many of the CEOs and chairs of these companies have been underlying that it's not really about the cost of action anymore. It is really the cost of inaction that far exceeds the cost of action, and that is the perspective that we need to apply. Then, coming back to the outcomes. And I have to say I'm pretty proud when I looked at this list. My only worry is now that it is so long that we could continue until tomorrow morning. So that is a problem that we can bear over with. So I have to take the main outcome, so don't bear over with me if I don't mention one of your particular initiatives. Today, I think many of us heard Colombia's President, Ivan Duque. He announced plans for a regional 8-country pact to increase contribution of renewable energy to 70% of their energy mix, not by 2050, but by 2030. This will have a lot of impact. The President also announced a new initiative by diverse cities aimed at reviving the economic health of cities in the Amazon basin. Crucial. The Mission Impossible, or Mission Possible rather, platform was launched with the backing of 23 companies and organizations. Its aim is to achieve carbon neutrality in 7 high-emission industry sectors, representing 30% of all global greenhouse gas emissions: aviation, shipping, trucking, aluminium, steel, chemicals, and cement. The Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, comprising 3 countries and 30 organizations, representing through their memberships 28 trillion of assets under management, was launched to promote public and private sector investment in climate resilient infrastructure. His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, established the Sustainable Market Council, a public-private philanthropic coalition working towards building and financing a new market approach at global scale. The Food Action Alliance was established as a new partnership between the public and private sectors and international multilateral organizations to support efforts to radically transform global food production. The Tropical Forest Alliance convened a Brazil strategic group, bringing together Brazilian and international businesses with the aim of halting deforestation linked to industry supply chains. The establishment of an affiliate center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in Norway, I didn't take out that piece, was announced. The center will focus on developing policies to accelerate the most innovative emerging technologies for protecting the world's oceans. The 4IR needs to get to work to protect our planet. 6 countries and 39 organizations across multiple business sectors formed the Just Rural Transition, a partnership aimed at helping rural areas prepare for a shift towards climate resilient and sustainable food, land use, and ecosystems. The partnership is backed by 12 million of funding from the UK government. Over 100 organizations from across the public and private sector came together to form the Global New Mobility Coalition, a partnership aimed at cutting traffic congestion and reducing transportation emissions by 95% by 2050 by integrating shared, electric, and autonomous mobility solutions. The Global Sustainable Energy Innovation Fund was announced, with the goal of building an investment fund of at least 1 billion euros for sustainable energy innovation that will be formally launched at the forum's annual meeting in Davos 2020. The Global Battery Alliance, that you all know, announced a 10-year plan to prepare the way for the technology to reduce emissions across energy and transportation by 30% by 2030. The Clean Air Fund was launched with initial funding of $50 million to focus multi-stakeholder efforts on helping the 90% of people worldwide that breathe polluted air. Projects are already underway in Poland, India, and China to deepen research and scale solutions. The goal is to increase the size of the fund to 100 million through philanthropic donations. The government of Egypt joined the World Economic Forum's Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator program, aiming to increase women's participation in labor force, increase integration into leadership positions, close wage gaps, and support women with the skills of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. A partnership between the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, the World Bank, and the World Economic Forum published a framework to facilitate greater private sector investment in projects addressing humanitarian crisis of fragility. We have to start to invest more in fragile states so they don't end up as failed states. The forum's media and entertainment industry team established a partnership of consumer brands, media platforms, content producers, distributors, and civil society to support digital safety by tackling hateful, violent, racist, and terrorist content online. We also announced a new partnership with UNDP and released a strategic value framework, which includes a new tool for understanding the effect of potential disruptions from emerging technologies, the climate emergency, and trade tension on global value chains. We have, during those 2 days, shown that it's not only been a meeting. We have walked the talk. There are concrete results coming out of this summit. So I think we rightly have called it a Sustainable Development Impact Summit. Thank you.
That's very impressive.
Thank you. And then I'm almost done. 2 things. First, I'm thanking the Conrad Hilton Foundation for their continuous support of the summit. It couldn't have happened without this support. And I would also like to use, of course, this opportunity to confirm that this summit will be a permanent feature on our annual meeting schedule. So we will meet in New York also next year and even produce more consequential results. And then all the summit could not have happened with the hard work of my colleagues at the World Economic Forum. It has been a big undertaking, and especially a thank to Terry Toyoda and Dominic Burrow and Sebastian Bukup. They have been leading different teams to make all this happen. But thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to our co-chairs. Thank you to all of you for coming. And thank you for all your support to making the world a more sustainable place. Thank you.